Can you first outline the sort of groups and individuals and the sort of ideas that we're talking about and which you've been investigating?
Yes, I've investigated a whole range of different extremist groups, ranging from very extreme and dangerous and potentially violent to more on the softer end of extremism. So I've, for example, investigated the misogynist Incel community, but also white nationalist and neo-Nazi movements, the QAnon conspiracy myth movement, as well as some of the very radical pro-Putin sympathizers.
Now, Julia, I know that you are incredibly well qualified academically, and your day job is working as a researcher at a think tank. So what made you decide your vocation, you could have chosen many, was to investigate groups like this?
It's a good question. I think it was a coincidence that I started really investigating this specific topic. I started out working on radicalization prevention and extremism prevention 8 years ago, when ISIS was just at the height of their power and they were recruiting European fighters to Syria and Iraq. And I had some friends who were caught up in the area of the Bataclan attack in Paris. So that was also what was a life-changing event for me, where I decided to devote my life to extremism prevention.
And you were then very young. You're still very young. As a 32-year-old woman, how do you go about infiltrating these sort of groups?
I've been doing this kind of undercover work for many years now. I usually always first set up online accounts, avatar or fake accounts, where I pretend to be someone I'm not. So I usually then develop these accounts to make them look credible over several months. And then I either reach out to extremist organizations to be recruited into their networks, or sometimes they actually reach out to me and want to do vetting procedures, for example, interviews or background checks to then welcome me into their communities.
Can you give us a little bit of a flavour of some of who these identities are online, or is that going to be a contravention of your tactics?
No, I think some of the undercover accounts that are still active, I wouldn't give any details about, but the ones that I covered in my latest book, I can talk about. I tend to set up many different accounts, and some are more successful than others. For example, for this latest book and for the research I did, I set an account called Claire Lafeuille, which was essentially a British-French activist, free speech warrior who was very easily manipulated into believing far-right extremist conspiracy myths and was somewhat sympathizing with white nationalism. So she was able to interview people like Mark Collett, who is the leader of the UK's extremist movement Patriotic Alternative. I also, for example, was pretending to be a man to get accepted into the Incels community, so into the very misogynist fringe community online. I was Alex Williamson for that purpose, pretending to be an unmarried single young man who was really frustrated about his situation and had given up all hope in himself, but also in politics and in society.
It's really fascinating, Julia. Presumably, you flesh out the sort of backgrounds and motivations behind these alternative identities in order that you can feel authentic when you're online acting as these people.
I usually try to develop these characters as if they were characters in a novel, where I really have to know about their past, their present, and their future. It's about sometimes even doing research on Google Maps to really understand, or on Google Earth to really understand, what does the area look like where they're coming from, or where they say they come from. What does the school teach, that, or which teachers are there where they say they did their they, for example, did their undergraduate studies. So it's usually quite a research intense exercise to really know fully your identity, or the person who you're trying to be.
Yeah, it sounds like a very comprehensive building of character. But you don't just do research online and infiltration online. You've also done it in real life too. Has that become more dangerous or difficult over time?
It definitely has become much more difficult in the last few years. On the one hand, of course, my identity and my face is now more well known, especially in extremist circles, where My identity was previously uncovered, for example, by the white nationalist movement, Generation Identity, which I infiltrated in 2017 already. So it's become more difficult now to go undercover offline, because then often I can't hide my face. At protests, it's sometimes easier because I can wear sunglasses and a hat. But otherwise, it's sometimes more tricky. And I have to say that most extremist movements have also become a lot more suspicious over recent years, because there were more security agents and researchers and also investigative journalists who've been trying to immerse themselves into these communities to gain more information about what's going on the inside. So they have introduced more rigorous vetting procedures. And sometimes I also hit a moral limit where I don't want to cross that limit, for example, of spreading radicalization materials or helping to disseminate campaign materials among wider audiences.
That must be a very difficult position for you to be in, both online and in real life. At what point are you learning from them and infiltrating? And at what point are you almost a double agent in a way? I can imagine it's difficult. I know in the book you also talk about being put in the position where in groups such as incel groups, men are talking about suicidal ideation, other people are wading in, trying to give suggestions to that. And it must be very difficult for you to stand by and watch these sort of incredibly difficult conversations without wanting to step in or help or act in a way as yourself rather than your fake identity.
It's sometimes extremely psychologically challenging. On the one hand, the content, the very toxic and hateful and partly violent content that I'm exposed to, that can actually create chronic trauma, which has been shown in research, which is a bit like one really severe traumatic situation, just that you don't realize that you're actually experiencing trauma. But also, as you say, not being able to intervene for fear of my cover being blown, that can sometimes be very difficult, especially when I see minors, sometimes school kids, becoming radicalized in these communities. In the incels forums, I did certainly witness many people's radicalization journeys, either towards such profound hatred towards themselves that they would voice suicide fantasies, and then others would share manuals on how to hang yourself or how to best kill yourself, which was really terrible to watch. And on the other hand, sometimes I would see the plotting of attacks or the announcement of specific acts of violence. In those cases, I do usually forward all of the information that I have to the relevant authorities. So there is, of course, also a responsibility as a researcher to do that.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly difficult. Psychologically, emotionally, and in terms of the logistics of running research while trying to be a responsible citizen. I want to talk a little bit more, Julia, about the Incel movement and about your infiltration of that group. In the UK, we have one attack that we know of that's been attributed to the Incel movement. But you are, I think, from what I've read, concerned that we're not really giving it enough attention, that there's not enough perhaps authority attention given to the incel movement, whereas in the US, they are regarded as a domestic terror group. Would you say in the UK, we're not really taking them quite as seriously as that? And have we got that wrong?
It's actually in Canada where Incel is designated a terrorist threat and is listed on the national security threat list. I'm not sure that the US has actually also lagged behind a little bit in dealing with the incel threat, but definitely the UK's decision not to even include violent misogyny as a hate crime, that has consequences, because it has consequences for resource allocation. Of course, the Prevent program is doing their best to also to really pick up on cases where, for example, teachers or frontline workers might have concerns about the radicalization of young men into those communities. But I would say overall, considering that it's a very fast growing threat, it's still a relatively small phenomenon, but it is growing very quickly. And considering that this is concerning especially the youngest generations, I think more resources should be devoted to that. And I do really fear that also some of the ideas that originated in violent misogynist forums have now penetrated more mainstream discourse, with influencers such as Andrew Tate, for example, on TikTok, who's been spreading violent misogynist ideas, including rape denial and glorification of violence towards women, to his millions of followers. And that I think we should take really seriously.
Yeah, Julia, I'm very interested. I want to ask you in a minute about the reasons for the mainstreaming of these formerly fringe ideas. And I know that there's not one reason at all. But before we get on to that, I just want to ask, do you think part of this rise in extreme violent misogyny is in some ways a backlash to the Me Too movement or to the advancement of feminism, which, as we know, has always been matched by a backlash at every stage?
Indeed, many of the extremist movements we're seeing today can be interpreted as backlashes against progressive liberal policies or campaigns that we've seen over the past few years or decades. It's interesting, looking at the reactions to the Me Too movement, there is definitely a strong sense that many of the people that I encountered in incels or in the wider misogynist so-called manosphere online were afraid that feminism was going too far and felt that their privileges as white males were taken away from them. So there was a sense that there was very deep frustration and anger about social progress happening too fast and them being overheard in that process. I do think we should take, of course, these concerns and these fears of men seriously and hopefully provide them with alternative solutions before they enter misogynist communities as a solution. But it is something where it's very difficult to find the right balance, because on the other hand, of course, feminism hasn't really gone far enough, I would say. There are still many differences, significant differences in the pay gap, for example, or in terms of women's rights. I don't think we've arrived yet at a stage where we can say feminism has gone too far.
No, indeed, Julia. So whether we're talking about misogyny or whether we're talking about far right or we're talking about conspiracy theories or anti-Semitism, what are the economic and the social and the political conditions that have enabled the stuff you're looking at in your book, this mainstreaming of formerly fringe ideas, to really ramp up so quickly and to so quickly be at the front line of politics and public discourse?
One thing that is definitely new and probably unprecedented in history is that we are facing a combination of, on the one hand, a global polycrisis with the health, security, and economic crisis that hit us in the last couple of years quite severely on a global scale. So COVID, of course, but also the Ukraine war or the Russian aggression war in Ukraine and the economic and living cost crisis. But at the same time, on the other hand, we're also facing a revolution through completely new technologies. And I'm not just talking about social media, but also the new AI-based technologies. This is quite a toxic combination that can lead to a lot of fears and to a lot of just uncertainty about the future. I think we've seen in the past, when looking back in history, that very often crisis moments triggered anti-minority hatred, triggered waves of conspiracy myths, even in times of the plague, long before any technologies were kind of on the market. There was the conspiracy myth, for example, that Jews had poisoned the wells that was circulating back then. Or in times of the cholera, we saw similar conspiracy myths about doctors who were blamed for or who were accused of harvesting organs. And now we have these multiple crises, as well as a very strong leveraging or exploitation of new technologies. And that has really accelerated the threats that we see from extremist movements and has enabled them to spread their ideas to millions of people.
Julia, these are very real and present threats, and none of those social changes look like slowing down anytime soon. What hope can you leave us with that this picture isn't all doom and terror?
One of the most hopeful things for me was to see always the human dimension, even in the most extreme of extremists that I interviewed for the book or that I encountered. I do think there's a lot of potential still for especially online intervention methods, where we have trialed a few of them. We've learned from the successes of what offline de-radicalization can look like, but I think we're still not yet quite there in applying them to fringe forums online, for example, to really having one-on-one mentoring programs that start online, perhaps even where users can stay anonymous in the beginning. And then the other thing that gives me hope is that there are also a lot of positive and progressive movements among the younger generations. When we look at the younger generations, there is a susceptibility that needs to be taken seriously to extremist narratives, but we can also hopefully educate them on especially on things like not just digital literacy, but also understanding the intersection of psychology and the digital technologies. So how do the digital technologies and social media impact us, all of us, on a psychological level? I don't think it's too late to educate the digital migrants, so the older generations either, but I think focusing on the younger generations is really important in the long-term future.
Thank you so